Hello and welcome to the 2022 November-December debate drills topic analysis. My name is Morgan Swigert. I am the Assistant Director of Public Forum Debate at Debate Drills, and today we are going to be going over short background on the topic, a couple AF arguments and a couple neg arguments. As all of you probably know, the topic is resolved. The United States strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. I think this is a fantastic topic. There is a lot to talk about in terms of foreign relations, lots of aspects such as economic, political, and military. And I think overall, the broad scope of this topic is, or the scope of this topic is very broad, and there's going to be lots of literature that is very interesting to read, lots of different nuanced argument strategies. So without further ado, let's jump into a little background on this topic. So first of all, what is great power competition? So great power competition is the idea that the idea of the United States competing with other powers to be the definitive world leader. So their main competitors, as you would imagine, are Russia and China. So the United States competes with them primarily for world domination. That would be control over the world's economic systems, control over or large political influences and alliances in other smaller countries, and third, and arguably most importantly, military dominance and supremacy. So you may have heard the terms unipolarity versus multipolarity. You also may have heard the term hegemony. So these all play in here. Unipolarity is the geopolitical theory of having one country that is definitively the world leader and then everyone else underneath them. And that is the current state that we exist in right now and have for a long time, or for a while, I would say arguably post World War II, when the United States emerged as the global superpower. Multipolarity is somewhat of the opposite. That is the idea of having more than one definitive world leader that they cooperate together to carry out all sorts of initiatives and lead the world. So in the current state of the world right now, the United States is the unipole, and the other countries that are vying for control are Russia and China. The other term, hegemony, which I mentioned, is the concept of global dominance. So when you hear the term United States hegemony, that refers to the idea of the United States being the definitive world leader. Those are all important things that go very, very deep in bodies of literature back almost over 100 years and are a very core concept in debate that you see across lots of debate topics. So this topic, we're going to be discussing, how the United States strategy of great power competition plays into modern geopolitics. Next, so what are the main areas that the United States competes in in this great power competition, right, to be the world superpower? So the first one, as you would imagine, would be military power, right? So we have a very, very large military. Our budget is to the tune of around 600 or 700 billion dollars. I think we are the largest spender in the world on military. If not, we're right up there with, the top three. So military power, the United States has worked very hard to exert its military power over the world in lots of different situations. We see this in its arms races with Russia, with North Korea. Obama pivoted the one large naval fleet from the Middle East over to the South China Sea so that we could project lots of military power in the South China Sea. We conduct joint military exercises with lots of countries. Japan and South Korea are two big ones to exert our power in the South China Sea. And then obviously we have had lots of military interventionism into the Middle East. So we've done a lot of things to exercise our military power there. So as you would imagine, China and Russia are also competing very heavily for military power, right? They're both significantly building up their arms. That has resulted in lots of tensions in the South China Sea with China and East China Sea, and then also in Eastern Europe with Russia. We saw that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then also the tension in the Baltic states, which was the September-October topic of last year of 2021. So lots to talk about on the military landscape, but that is kind of one of the main areas that the United States competes in for great power competition. Next would be political power and influence. So this is a little bit more abstract. It involves more the United States involvement in certain political arenas, like the United Nations, the UNSC, the World Trade Organization, and all sorts of other international forms of international cooperation. They also make lots of political deals, political and economic deals with certain countries or bodies such as the European Union that give the United States significant political influence. So all sorts of different trade and military alliances give the United States political influence over certain countries. Also, economic influence does translate pretty significantly to political influence. China has been very good at this with their Belt and Road Initiative, right? In making deals with smaller, less affluent countries to make these infrastructure investments, China has been able to establish political footholds in lots of these developing world countries through their economic power. So that is one way that China has worked to compete against the United States for world political power. So there are almost infinite ways in which the United States has been able to exert its political power over the rest of the world, and ways that China and Russia have been trying to do the same to counteract the United States. So that is the second of the three pillars of great power competition. And the third, as you would also imagine, is economic power. So all three of these kind of go hand in hand. The economic power would concern United States making trade deals with other countries. The trade deals such as NAFTA is one big trade deal that is between the United States and Canada and Mexico. And there are all sorts of other trade deals that they have with the European Union, with China even. The United States, as you would imagine, is the economic powerhouse of the world right now, but China is competing very heavily against the United States in terms of innovation and economic output. So United States versus China is a big battle that is currently happening on the economic stage. Russia, not as much. They're a big oil exporter, so they are a big player in the oil economy. So in that sense, they factor into economic competition, but largely it is the United States and China that are competing against each other as the world economic power. One other thing to note here on the economy is dollar hegemony. So the dollar is the current accepted world currency, and that has given the United States significant economic power and leverage over all other countries, especially China. And so you will likely see arguments about the collapse of dollar hegemony is what it's called, the concept of the dollar being used as the world's currency. And so that is another thing that has recently come into question, is whether or not the dollar will remain the world currency as opposed to some other currencies that are becoming very strong. So those are kind of the three main areas in which the US is competing for world dominance. So let's talk about the affirmative. There are a couple critical arguments that are going to make up the core of the AF. So let's get into the first one. The first one is democracy. So the United States provides a democratic model for other countries to follow. The blanket debate term and political term that is used here is just modeling, right? So because the United States has a democratic system that is significantly more favorable than China or Russia's political systems, which are much more, which involve much more, centralized power and communist undertones. This is a good thing, right? That the United States is a global power because they are able to export their democratic ideals towards other countries, right? So if other countries are looking to the world leader for their model of government, it's much better that they're looking towards the United States than Russia or China, because the United States has a much more fair and democratic system to model for other countries. The other implication here is that the United States can export their democratic process to other countries. So as the global superpower, the United States can help other countries rebuild their political systems after bad crises happen. And so when the United States is the one that is the main country that is helping others rebuild their political systems, they can export their model of democracy towards other countries. And so that would then in turn lead to the spread of democracy across the world rather than the spread of communism. This was a big deal in the 1960s with the Cold War. It was why we went to war in Vietnam. was that the United States was trying very, very hard to fight the global spread of communism. So eventually we were able to, for the most part, prevent that spread of communism. And so now democracy is used in lots of other countries where possibly if the United States had lost a lot of these battles in the 60s, we would have seen communism kind of taking over in Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia. So yeah, like I said, foreign interests widely promote democracy. The next argument here is deterrence. I think this is a very big argument and likely going to be the core of the affirmative. This is an argument that can take a lot of different forms, but I think like I said, it is going to be the basic principle of most arguments in favor of the concept of unipolarity or United States hegemony. This is kind of the basis for why hegemony is good. The shorthand term for this is hedge is good versus hedge is bad. You're going to hear that in a lot of these debates. So the idea goes like this: having one global power deters others from military adventurism. It's the idea that when everyone knows definitively who is leading the world, no one is likely to challenge anyone else for world leadership. Multipolarity as a contrast would encourage power struggles because there is no clear leader, right? So the United States wants to be the world power. That is clear, and that is true right now. If the United States were to cease its doctrine of great power competition and were to try to pursue a multipolar world with Russia and China, there is nothing that is saying that, excuse me, nothing that is saying that China and Russia will not then fight against the United States to take them down and to become that global power. So multipolarity leads inevitably to great power struggles and makes great power war much more likely. Whereas if everyone agrees that there's one clear world leader, then no one is going to challenge them as much because they know that they're going to lose. And so there just becomes a lot more division and a lot more ideological differences that lead to great power struggles if you have a world of multipolarity. So, in summary, if the United States remains the one global superpower, they deter other great power struggles. And so the impact here would be war or conflict, or really you can pick lots of different conflict scenarios that you can employ here. Conflict scenarios with Russia, with China. I'll talk about those when we talk about the negative. So that is going to be the core of the affirmative, right? Is being able to say unipolarity is better because it doesn't allow for these challenges, these great power challenges, and this friction between great powers that everyone agrees are equal. Jumping into the negative, the first would be great power war. So the argument here is pretty simple. Military competition will eventually lead to a breaking point. So if the United States continues to compete against China for world domination, eventually China will get fed up. And instead of everyone working to an agreement of multipolarity, if the United States continues to, fight this fight against China and Russia, eventually it's going to lead to a great power war and conflict will break out. There are some flashpoints that I alluded to just now. First, the most likely scenarios for great power war between the United States and China would be the South China Sea, which is where there are a lot of territorial disputes with other countries that are U.S. allies, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia. And so, the United States has a very strong military presence in the South China Sea. It's working very hard to project its power there. They conduct military operations there or military drills. And so if there is a conflict flashpoint between the United States and China, it would likely be in the South China Sea. The other possibility is a Taiwan scenario, where China wants to annex Taiwan and take them back into their rule, and the United States is currently backing Taiwan. And so if China believes that there is weakness in the United States, or if there continues to be escalation between the United States and China because of this great power competition, then we could possibly see a scenario where China invades Taiwan, which would create lots of problems, as you would imagine. Next are the Russia scenarios. So there are two main Russia scenarios. Obviously, for both Russia and China, there are many, many, many more possible war scenarios that include proxy wars in all sorts of places around the world. But these are just the main scenarios that are likely to A, have the biggest impacts, and B, have the most literature behind them. So on to Russia first is a Ukraine scenario. This is pretty self-explanatory because Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been pretty big in the news. This would mean, Russia is looking for a way to push back against the United States because the United States is continuing to try to struggle to maintain power. And so the conflict flashpoint here would be in Ukraine. Russia would continue to push through Ukraine or other parts of Eastern Europe, and the United States would eventually come to their defense via Article 5 of NATO. Speaking of Article 5 of NATO, the other possible scenario is Baltic states. So like I said, this was the 2021 September-October topic, was about whether or not NATO should increase its military support to the Baltic states. So, ask your older team members, look through some back files. I'm sure there's lots of impact and link evidence here about Baltic states invasion scenarios. Three Baltic states are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They are all members of NATO and thus protected by Article 5. They border Russia, and Russia believes that they have an ethnic claim to these countries. They believe that there are ethnic Russians in these countries, that Russia has historically had control over this land, and so Russia desperately wants to have this land back and invade them and take it back like they did with Crimea and more recently with Ukraine. And so the problem here is that because these countries are members of NATO, Russia hasn't invaded yet because they don't want to trigger Article 5. So this, similar to the South China Sea, is another territorial dispute that is likely going to be the biggest flashpoint between Russia and the United States backed NATO. So those are the main conflict scenarios that we could see for great power war. This could happen. These could be all impact scenarios on the affirmative as well. Like I was talking about deterrence here, if multipolarity were to be a thing, there were to be great power struggles, there were to be war, these are the conflict scenarios that would result as well. The next negative argument is economic competition. So the main thing here is that trade protectionism slows economic growth. If the United States is competing instead of cooperating with China or Russia, but mainly China, that's likely to lead to trade protectionism. You all read about the trade war that Trump launched against China during his administration, and everyone knows that trade wars are very bad for the economies of both countries. So the argument here would be, rather than engaging in trade protectionism to try to make sure that the United States remains the global economic power, the United States could be cooperating more economically with Russia and China to strengthen the economies of both countries and thus the economies of the world. So this would be the other negative argument, is that the economic competition is actually bad and there should be more cooperation in terms of innovation and everything else. You could also argue that the economic competition is good, right? The main warrant for this is in terms of innovation. If the United States and China are both fighting against each other to be the leading economic power, there's more incentive for either country to develop much more technological innovation, and so we have more innovation that results. So there could be an argument on both sides. So to conclude, there really are a large scope of issues that you could talk about on this topic, which I think is really great. Each issue has a very, very wide body of literature. So the way that I see this topic breaking down is that there are three main pillars, subject matter pillars that you could talk about: military power, political power, and economic power. And within those three pillars, you can choose lots of very specific scenarios that can happen, or very specific things that involve specific countries or specific trade deals or specific political alliances, military alliances, conflict scenarios, all that stuff. So I would advise you to consider interesting twists on stock arguments. So if you take, for example, the stock concept of deterrence on the AF, right? But then you are, rather than just saying, oh, the United States as the superpower can deter great power war, whatever, and just have your case get torn apart, try to pick out a very specific impact conflict scenario here and say, because the United States is the world superpower, that is preventing this specific conflict from breaking out in this specific area. And that way you can be much more specific. You can get yourself out of the generalized responses, and you're more likely to surprise your opponents. But you also have a very strong foundation of the argument because it's rooted in a stock argument and a core concept on this topic. So thank you all for watching. I really hope this was helpful, and good luck with your prep and tournaments on this topic.